Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe. Today's video is a new podcast modeled after the 12 Great Men of Middle-earth podcast that I started a while back. This video, though, will navigate the history of the first great human figure in the history of Krynn. That's right, this is going to be focused around the history of Dragonlance by going into the lives of 7 great men who inhabited different ages all across the history of Krynn. Therefore, without further ado, let's get started. Ackal Ergot is one of the most fascinating figures in the history of Krynn. He never appears on screen, so to speak, and appears to arise from nowhere to claim a place similar to that occupied in Elvish history by Kif-Kanan. Though not the greatest human to ever live, Ackal, though, is a figure whom has little direct contact with the majority of the narrative of Dragonlance, and yet his shadow looms over the history of Ergoth in Salamnia, both countries that have their roots in his many accomplishments that are more numerous than what most people might realize. His would be a life full of greatness, of evil yet majestic actions, with his deeds not just many but incomparable for centuries. With his empire, one that would at its height stretch from Hilo in the north, stretching as far southeast as Carolus, all the way to the Krynn Ocean in the northeast. To understand the context of Ackal's actions and the state of Krynn at the time of his birth, one should understand the recent history of Krynn at that time. The first age was that of Starfall, one that saw the whole of Ansalon, the principal continent of Krynn, ravaged by countless battles in the All-Dragons War, begun by the cruel Takhisis, in her jealousy of her brother's first creations, the first dragons she corrupted, so that he turned to Reorx to aid him to create a new generation of dragons. Wherefore, she had her dragon slay his, in an attempt to prove her superiority to him. There was a brief respite from the violence, though, with the gods discovering that the stars in the skies were in reality spirits, a realization that precipitated violence as the 3 different pantheons engaged in direct violence themselves in what was called the All Saints War. They might well have destroyed all of Krynn were it not for the intervention of High God, their father, who put a stop to the war, grounded them, and instructed them to give offerings to the spirits that peppered the night sky. The gods of good created physical bodies. Those of neutrality gave them free will, and those of evil gave them desire and ambition. These spirits, when they took physical shape, were to become the ogres, elves, and humans that populate Krynn. What is more is that it was at this time that the gods of magic were born. The gods Solinari, Lunitari, and Nuitari. More violence and wars were to follow between the gods. It was either that or, I don't know, start a soccer team or a chess club. This was way more fun. Though they were never to again engage in direct warfare with one another, for fear of the repercussions and angering High God again. Their bottoms were still sore after the last spanking he gave them. The next great event was the creation of the great artifact by Reorx known as the Grey Gem, who showed all the wisdom in the view of a great many in Krynn of a rock, when he not only did this, but later activated it, causing to the great horror of all who appreciate private possessions and family heirlooms, the creation of kenders and also gnomes, though this development took place in the Age of Dreams. So just to clear things up, the Grey Gem is created in the Age of Starburst, hidden away for a while, then used in the Age of Dreams. Realizing the depths of the stupidity and evil of these actions, or so might say certain dwarves, Reorx was to seal away the terrible artifact in the Red Moon of Lunitari on her advice. This was also the last great event of the Age of Starbirth. The next and second age of Krynn was that of Dreams, a tremendously important age, one that is sometimes extended from the year 9000 pre-cataclysm to 960. It technically spans only to the year 5000 pre-cataclysm, when it is followed by the poorly named Age of Light, which was a rather chaotic, war-filled era, which spans from 5000 to 960. Hop on over to the Age of Dreams. At the outset of the age, there would be a new war started between the children of Takhisis and those of Paladin, as the former got up to her old tricks again. This time, the ogres and elves would join in the conflict in the name of the Queen of Darkness and the Lord of Light, respectively, since they had nothing better to do. The war went as one might expect for the landlocked races of Ansalon, badly. As to the dragons, Takhisis' lizards would tear asunder the majority of Paladin's daughters in a series of ambushes until there was only one left. She in turn would, when Takhisis' babies came after her, turn the tables and ambush them, though she did die in the battle that resulted. It would take centuries centuries for the preheated eggs to crack open and reveal the infants for whom Paladin and his daughters had sacrificed so much for. In the millennia that followed, though, it is not dragons that came to dominate the continent, but rather the Ergot, also known as High Ogres. They would build incomparable empire at the time and enslave humans after reorcs taught men how to make tools out of pity for them. The Ergot would build and develop many useful tools and monuments. They would create the first great empire, as said, only for it to fall due to the brutality of their cruelty. Unfortunately for them, one of their numbers would bring the whole thing down. His name was Krynn. Yep, the ogre who brought it all down was named after King Arthur's mom. And yes, we can all laugh at this. With that out of the way, many of the ogres would afterwards lose not only their empire, but their very intelligence and beautiful appearance, turning into the Tolkienian orcs we have all come to identify them with. So yeah, Krynn was a dick for finally getting that Jiminy Cricket conscience. Who needs it? And who needs him? We've now reached the period right after the Grey Gem activation, and the First Dragon's War breaks out. Why? Takhisis had nothing better to do, and Sargonis was off with the boys to see the game. That's why. This war would have dire repercussions for Takhisis' faithful, though, as it was during this war that an elf rose up to unite his people, fight off the evil dragons, and form the great kingdom of Silvanesti. This elf, whom gave his name to his people, was called Silvanos, and he'd fight a losing battle for quite some time, until, that is, the 5 dragon stones were created by the first few mages that were running around at the time. They would unite the forces of light, darkness, and grayness together, and use this great surge of energy to access the metaphysical energy of the dragons in order to sealing up the dragons. After the stones secured victory by sealing up the dragons, and Silvanesti was firmly in place, the next kids on the block to create something of a society from the ashes of Ansalon, after that great dragon war, would be the Dwarves and the Minotaurs. The first kingdoms, though, entered into an early war, one that broke the backs of the latter's kingdom. Not that the Dwarves got to enjoy their empire very long, as the empire of Calthrax fell and was replaced by that of Thorn. And yes, the second dwarvish kingdom is named after the co-lead and one of the major heroes of The Hobbit. I see what you did there, Hickman, Wace, and the rest of you. How very droll of you. I should scold you, but instead, I approve of this action. Good on you. We need more Tolkien nods in modern fantasy. And now that we have that out of the way, we have to deal with the Second Dragon's War, which was the result of those shiny dragon rocks breaking open after the Dwarves of Thorin found them, took them to the surface, because, you know, seemed like a good idea at the time, with the evil dragons striking at Silvanesti, with the attack against them and the mages who came together to try and defend the elves, resulting in thousands of deaths. There were 3 mages, though, who would defeat the dragons by having the earth swallow the dragons whole. I'm not joking. They seriously did that. And once the earth let loose the most disgusting and noisy burp in Krynn's entire history, releasing untold amounts of methane into the atmosphere, the mages were taken by the gods of magic into their tower to answer for this stupid act. I'm kidding. They actually took them there to reward them and get them to found the Order of High Sorcery. As to the dwarves, they would close up Thorin and try to find shop elsewhere. Okay, got the background of the world and just what sort of stress the other races were in by this time, which is now the Age of Light, and have seen all the Tolkien nods. It is time to give nods to that other great near founder of fantasy fiction, Robert E. Howard, as by this time, many of the humans in the west of Ansalon had become not more civilized, but less so. Most notably, the humans of the Kalkist region had, over the course of the Ages of Dreams and Light, formed into warring tribes and clans that waged bloody conflicts and were utterly uncouth. Such was the violence that the humans, not only of the Kalkist region, engaged in, but other places throughout the continent, that elves and dwarves decided to have as little to do with these humans as possible. Yep, they definitely had a good point, since the humans had neither developed at this time table manners, nor the habit of peeving ancient evil dragons and releasing them back into the world. Now that said, there were villages and towns here and there popping up amongst the humans, but these little city-states, if one could term them that, were hardly that impressive, with the most noteworthy and relevant to our tale being that of Sanction. Built in a location surrounded by 3 gargantuan volcanoes, known as the Lords of Doom. It was quite the town, and later would become infamous as a city filled with evil. Quite why anyone would think it could possibly have been a poor choice and location for a city with 3 big volcanoes carrying such a grim name is beyond me. Ackal Ergot, though, was born in the village of Sanction. He likely came from either a farming family or a tribe that had sought safety in the village later known as the Dark City, and were likely named the Ergot tribe. Ackal, though, was not born after the War of the Second Dragon's War, but during it. As you can imagine, it would have colored his vision of things, being born during such a time and likely faced with depredations of conflict. It likely would have been little comfort to him or any of his tribesmen who might have survived, or even the citizens of the town of Sanction, that the conflict was little more than an accident. His was likely a troubled childhood, spent with his brother on the streets of the town. Likely their father had been sent to fight the dragons, and he likely perished. And if he didn't die in the decades-long war, it is still likely he would have had a tough life, scraping together a living in a town that was likely quaking in fear of possible impending dragon assaults, or the Lords of Doom exploding with lava, as they were occasionally wont to do. Born near to the date of 2650 pre-cataclysm, it is likely that sometime between the age of 4 and 10, he was deployed as a child soldier or ran off to participate and was accepted, as he was rather tall for his age, into the army that was sent out to fight against the dragons. In fact, Ackal would likely be one of the tallest and physically strongest humans in the whole of Wason Hickman's legendarium. Made to fight at a young age, it was likely that he left his brother Bazin behind him, and that he was to come out of this conflict when it ended in 2645, a very damaged human being. Ackal, though, wasn't stupid, as he learned a great deal about war from his time as a child soldier, learning self-reliance, how to fight both in a unit and on his own, and that he could trust and count on no one. This last lesson likely came from seeing countless men and children die, so that he grew desensitized to the value of human life. He also likely developed the terrible fits of rage and passionate nature that would haunt his every step and moment in his later years during this time. After the war, though, he returned to Sanction, where he spent some time with his brother Bazin, likely teaching him to fight, and some of the wondrous military tactics and strategies that were to come so naturally to both brothers. It is during the period that followed that Ackal's first legends are dated, or said to have taken place shortly after he grew to full manhood. Ackal would, it is said, single-handedly slay an entire Bakali tribe in combat. Now, it is possible that the large, likely 6'6" to 7 foot tall, muscled giant who seems to have more than a little in common with both Kull and Gorm from Howard's stories accomplished such a feat, but it is unlikely that the clever Ackal would have engaged in such a stupid act without backup. While he was certainly an adventurer by this time, Ackal was not the sort of adventurer we might know from our D&D sessions or from those silly Japanese anime. He was a clever man, so how he accomplished this deed was very likely done when the Bakali lizards folk slept. He most likely waited under camouflage, slipped into the camp without being noticed, and slit the throats of all he walked past. It may not be the cleanest of victories, but at least it was practical. And when one's life and countrymen are in danger, a little dirty play can be excused, I say. Which is why I certainly hope he took a bath after that little bit of mass murder, as that kind of act tends to stain. While some of the evil dragons were sealed away, there were very likely a few still left wandering around in the world, such as the dragon Blackworm. I dare you to try to guess his coloration. It is said that Ackal didn't do what a great many warriors faced with a dragon might. He did not slay him, but rather he captured Blackworm. How he did so has never really been made clear, and it is unsure if this took place after the greatest of Ackal's adventures or before them. With that little detail out of the way, Ackal channeled the dragon's breath into helping him to temper his sword, which would become his prized possession. Having tamed Blackworm, and likely disposed of him afterwards, as he had outlived his youthfulness, the gargantuan adventurer was to now clash with a dark priest known as Rackal. With Rackal's race and location of death, along with the exact year of this event, once again unclear. What is clear is that after these adventures, Ackal grew bored with such easy pickings, if they can be termed such. Choosing to afterwards venture off whither to the Sentinel Mountains, it would be there that Ackal would first discover the artifact of the Irda known as the World's Heart. Accessing it briefly, he would be shown a vision of himself leading the Kalkis tribes into a new age, one which saw him crowned as their emperor. Pleased and likely dreaming now of glories that he had previously only occasionally thought of, Ackal was chased out of the Sentinel Mountains, so that he returned to Sanction, gathered together what adventurers he could, and returned to seize this time not the world's heart, but the vast hordes of gold and jewels and silver that surrounded it and that filled up the once great ogre cities. Using these to repay his lackeys, it is likely about this time that he befriended his best friend Talandruth. Either that, or he had befriended him in childhood. Regardless, Talandruth and him were to brave many adventures and dangers together, alongside other similar-minded adventurers who were friends of theirs. It is at this time that Ackal's war of domination truly began, as he bribed certain chieftains into following him, and annihilated, with their assistance, those who would resist him. One of the tribes that followed Ackal was to also agree to elect his brother Bazin Ergot to the status of chieftain, with Bazin given a great deal of liberties in these early years in his wars against some of the anti-Ackal tribes, as some of them had forged an anti-Ackal league, with Bazin proving himself not only an incredibly loyal general, but a superbly competent one, though not as competent as Talandruth. We'll briefly take a detour to explore the fact that Ackal had a series of fortresses built around this time. Very likely he had observed the architecture of the cities of the Irda and fought to fashion his own, and over the years had befriended some of the master builders of Sanction and formed ties with some of the dwarf merchants that were always upon the road, keen to ply their trade on new projects. So while Bazin and his free-roaming riders enjoyed the airy outdoors and built ties between themselves and other like-minded tribes, Talandruth and Ackal built on a monumental scale. They built large fortresses to house their wealth and keep out their enemies. The trouble with Bazin was that he had quickly fallen in love with his position as chieftain and began to lead his new tribe as though he were truly independent from his brother. The seeds planted for a future conflict between their differing philosophies. Bazin liked being a chieftain in a decentralized tribal kind of life, while Ackal dreamt of conquest and empire. But for the moment, their differences were not yet that noticeable, as rumors of a beautiful woman circulated the land. This woman was a remarkably vivacious and beautiful human woman by the name of Balalana, the wife of the Lord of the Western Hundred, one of the greatest of the Kalkist tribal chiefs. It was highly likely that he was an early ally of sorts of Ackal's, though this can't be confirmed. What can be confirmed is that this man was essentially a chief of chiefs, all but king in that region. And what can also be confirmed is that Ackal made war upon the other chieftain, slaughtered the majority of the 100 tribes with the Lord, and took Balalana for his own, and fathered several sons upon her. Incredibly jealous by nature, Ackal imprisoned Balalana in one of his by now completed fortresses, keen to keep her away from other men so that they might not taint her. It is highly likely that he left her with only female servants, in order to maintain the purity of his line, with any male servants, men-at-arms, and tutors likely to be housed elsewhere, with his sons moved into separate forts where they could be tutored. This is not to say that Balalana and the other members of Ackal's by now growing harem were completely severed from their children. Likely they could visit them. It is just that they were kept under close scrutiny when around any men. It is also highly possible that by this time, Ackal's often murderous rages were getting out of hand, comparable with those of the likes of Genghis Khan or Henry VIII or even Henri II d'Anjou. Therefore, we have to explore the fact that as the years had progressed and as his conquests had grown, Ackal had begun to grow into a little bit of an unhinged man at times. He would, it is said, murder men in drinking brawls, murder men for their wives, as noted, and being fearful of being dislodged from his position as Lord of the Kalkist tribes, taken to murdering his own favorite followers and friends. Such was the vindictiveness and profundity of his rages that he even came to murdering his boyhood best friend Talandruth, his finest general who had helped secure so many victories in the wars against the various Kalkist tribes, was butchered in a fit of rage. It is also implied he may have turned the skull of this great friend into a goblet, as he had done to others, with Ackal having by now also, legend has it, developed the habit of drinking the blood of his enemies, rather like Vlad Dracul was said to have done. Whether there is any validity to the blood drinking, we can't say, though I lean towards him doing the skull cup thing, as it has the distinctive brutal logic of a true barbarian and monster, which Ackal tended to be. As to any kind of implication of him drinking blood or being a vampire, I don't subscribe to that theory. But this wasn't the worst thing he was to do. Oh no, that has yet to come. I'm sure you're thinking, What could be worse than slaying your best friends and turning their skulls into goblets? Or imprisoning the woman you love? Well, how's about fratricide? Yes, dear listeners, it so happened that eventually Basin's wild roaming ways came to clash with a seemingly bored Ackal, likely well into his 40s or 50s by now. Ackal Ergot was to decide one day, hey, you know what? I haven't talked to Basin in a while. I better go do that. While I'm at it, I'll remind him who's in charge, with Basin stupidly declaring himself an independent chieftain in response, and then the real master over the Calcast region. What was the result, you may wonder? Naturally, the tribes and armies that they marched against one another would have nothing to do with this fratricidal rivalry. Basically, these barbarians and mercenaries told their leaders, you want to fight and kill so badly? Why don't you do it? Because we'll have no part of this. To which both brothers said, sure, and proceeded then in the middle of the fields to begin a duel to the death for dominance of the tribes of the Calcast region. It is a deeply disturbing fact in the tale of Ackal and Basin Ergot that both of them forgot for a little while that they were brothers. Both were likely the finest physical specimen of their time. Both were brilliant generals, and both of them were passionate men who could not stomach being second banana to another. Thus, the duel they fought lasted for hours and saw both brothers, for all that they had against one another, with such vigor and hatred that one could not be blamed for forgetting that these two men were supposed to be siblings. But blood meant nothing to them then. It wasn't long, though, before blood did mean something, though. And that something was the defeat and death of Basin Ergot. He had been loyal, competent, and more than anything, the closest person in the world to Ackal. But that had all gone wrong in recent years, as he forgot his loyalties, getting ideas in his head of becoming a chief of chiefs, or some such leader of the Calcast tribes. Much as Ackal was a monster for killing Basin, the latter was by no means a victim, given that he had forgotten his own part of the bond that linked him to Ackal. He had come to view himself as an equal of Ackal, when he should have remembered that he was but a vassal, a lackey, and this could not be forgiven. Alright, so Ackal's disposed of all other leaders of the Calcast tribes. He subjugated all his enemies and united all the tribes beneath him. You must be thinking, is he going to lead like Attila or Chinggis from the saddle? No. For Ackal was no horse-riding barbarian who dreamt of annexing the whole of the world. While certainly psychotic, he was still a pragmatist, and had by this time decided there could be no escape from the mortal coil, nor did he desire to eternally be in the saddle. Instead, the great warrior had a magnificent palace and city of incomparable beauty built. The world had in some ways never seen this kind of sight before. This was a magnificent city, perfectly planned, with incredible organizational thinking applied to it. As magnificent as anything built by the elves, Ergot, or Dwarves, except for the fact that it was not built by those people, or for them. It was built for men. It was the great palatial city of Deltagoth that Ackal built. Though it was an almost completed city, it was rather different in appearance of the Empire's founder from that of his later-day descendants. For one thing, the Durmount portal gates were not yet fully constructed, nor named as such. They would have to wait until the end of his son's reign before they were to bear such a name. As it was, after the city was near completed, Ackal was formally crowned Emperor of Ergot, with Balalana crowned Empress, and Ackal's other wives princess consorts, so that there was a hierarchy within the harem. It was the culmination of a lifelong ambition, one that Ackal had long dreamt of. Sure, there was still a great deal to accomplish in terms of conquest, but the empire was more or less formed. The name of the empire was naturally derived, along with his dynastical name, from his surname. Now we get to the juicy part, the death of the emperor. The death of the emperor, though, was not to be a glorious one, because if you're expecting a glorious death or a slow decline into senility, you're destined to be disappointed. With that said, there is one last mystery that surrounds Ackal Ergot. His reign was a short one, lasting only for 5 years, by the end of which he was old and would apparently tumble down a flight of stairs in his new great palace, whereupon he cracked his skull open or snapped his neck and died instantly. There is, however, a rumor that survived that he was pushed down the stairs by assassins, with this the most likely answer, though for whom and for what reason they may have killed him, it's not easy to answer. We must first consider which of those still alive might have justifiable cause, and the means and access. I know a lot of of people may consider Balalana, but this seems a little unlikely to me. Not that I don't think she didn't have a resourceful side, but rather it is a matter of access. She likely wielded incredible influence and power, and it would fit rather poetically considering the fact that the second Talandruth in the story of Ergoth was to encounter an empress with a history of assassinating emperors, whose story kind of mirrors Balalana's tale in some ways. The trouble is that Ackal likely kept her under far too much scrutiny, and she had likely lost some of his interest, given that she had grown old alongside him. With that out of the way, I do think she might have been aware of who was behind the assassination. Though she did not act, I suspect that it was likely a cabal of ministers and generals who likely feared for their own lives. It may have even have involved her son, though it is likely that mother and son suspected that the father may in the end dispose of them in one of his infamous fits of rage. By this time, Ackal had likely come to depend upon his nation's crown prince to manage most of the military affairs of the empire, and some domestic, and it is likely that he was impatient to claim the throne, as well as afraid of his terrible father. The Ergothian dynasty was to later develop a tendency to destroy one's own kin, a habit that can be attributed to being the founder's fault. Regardless of how he perished, Ackal was succeeded by his son in one of the smoothest succession ceremonies in the history of Ansalon, which brings up the question of just how mother and son were so well prepared. Not all ministers and officers from Ackal the First's generation made it through the first years of Ackal II's reign, I suspect. Either they were involved in the murder, or they were convenient fall guys. Ackal II, though, would rule far more wisely than his father, and was to begin construction of the main kingly road system of the Ergothian Empire that became known as Ackal's Path. Ackal II, though, would die just shy of the Dermount Portal, which was to thereafter bear the name Dermount Portal after Ackal II's birth name, as he had adopted the name of Ackal as a regnal name. He died in the year 2575, likely of a stroke or heart attack, an entire 20 years after the death of his father, who passed away in 2595. It was shortly after the start of Ackal II's reign that Ackal was given the moniker by historians and Ostinus of the Great. And while it may not seem appropriate given the bloodshed and cruelty exhibited by the first ruler of the Empire of Ergoth, I think it fitting. He found the lands of the Kalkas tribes wild and uncivilized, and divided and imparted to them a common language, a common culture, a set of cities, and most of all, a sense of nationhood. It was also him who imparted to them a unified religion, commerce with the larger outside world, and so much more. Born a mere peasant, Ackal rose to imperial glory and was to create an empire in some ways far more glorious and magnificent than any the Dwarves or the Sylvanesti did build. It would not be until the coming of the Qualinesti or Solania that Krynn would see such magnificence, as this empire was to be far more lasting and enduring and glorious than any built by the Irda or by the Sylvanesti elves. And when one considers the way his reign tied up with wars that would be passed down to his son and grandson Ergothus the First, how peaceful the heartland of Ergoth was, and how wealthy it soon became, it is hard to argue with the results and the merit of the worship his subjects later engaged towards him. What is more is that, in comparison to the later Ergot dynasty period, which was to be occupied with endless palace coups, unstable rulers, and a seemingly endless civil war, no doubt Ackal's reign was a golden age. What are we to make of Ackal's brutal and strange tale? I think, for one thing, we ought to derive the lesson of the importance of family and kinship. And rather than give vent to fury and rage, try to be more patient with one another. For another thing, we should know that to treat others as we'd like to be treated, lest it should come back to boomerang against us. I can't help but think, though, that there's something tragic about Ackal. He had so much potential, such possibilities for good existed within him, yet he always chose the wrong path, always chose anger and hate over love and forgiveness. With that said, he was to produce a great deal of good, if indirectly, down through the centuries. Honestly, he's one of my favorite figures in Krynn and Ergoth's history, due to the fascinating questions he brings up, and how similar he is to a number of Byzantine rulers from Greek history. So with that said, I think it is high time I end this video. Next time, I'll be discussing Wormslayer, the Sword of Kifkanon, its history, powers, and importance to the legendarium of Dragonlance. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button, like your Huma taking down Takesis with the mighty Dragonlance.